keep in mind that these revenue sources are closely tied to the, the gas sales tax and use tax. So I don't know if you remember in the news a couple weeks ago, they were talking about maybe waiving some of the sales tax related to gas because of the high prices. We didn't know how this would affect this revenue source because it's also funded for it. So I think they had the idea of plugging that hole with other state funding, but I don't think it came to fruition. But that's how this revenue goes. So it's definitely not set in stone, but it is based on a good estimate from the state documents.
Where's the other spot for that?
It's underneath the local. We'll talk about that fund next. It's
Okay.
next one. So.
Thank you.
And it's more than offsetting, right? So that's that 81,000. That's what I mentioned, right? The fuel price goes up, and the revenue sharing goes up, and then the
Cost me to pay for it, yeah.
well, in this case, I don't know if we have other, but if fuel tax or fuel went up 81,000, so we got the 205. But
Mr. Chair,
yeah.
you gotta keep in mind, that's an estimate. A living, breathing document, and a lot of people will drive less because fuel is more expensive, so that could change that number too. So, because it's through the whole state, not just the city of Taylor. So,
Well, just like our budget. That's an estimate. They go through the estimate conferences, just like periodically, we revise the budget once we start seeing reality. All right, any other questions for Brooks?
So, Mr. Chairman, the next fund is now for the local street fund, which is on, it's on page 8 if you're looking at numbers to the right, but page 30 if you're looking at the numbers in the middle, page numbers. So the local street fund, just to go over while we're looking at the revenues, approximately the revenue for next year is about 1.9 million. So if you remember, just to talk about the relationship between the major and local street funds, if you remember, the major revenue was about 5.5 million, but we only get just under $2 million for our local roads. Well, historically, not just at our city, but at almost every city that I've worked with in the past, people spend more money on their local roads. So what is allowed is the major street fund can transfer up to 1/2 of its state sharing revenue to the local street fund. And you see that on this page, when you see that line item right above the total revenue, you see in there 699, the interfund transfer, major street fund. That's what that represents. We're taking about $2.7 million of the major street funds allocation and transferring it to the local street fund so that the city can use those on local roads. And again, you look at the history, and it's at almost every city that I know of that does that with these funding sources. So, because it seems like the concentration more is on the local roads. So that being said, I'm going to go a couple pages down, but the fund acts exactly like the major street fund, except it's related to local roads. So let's talk about the fund balance in the local street fund. So for the current year, fiscal year 22, the current budget is actually using $2.3 million of funds. The proposed budget for fiscal year 22 has a little bit of savings, but it's still a proposed $2.2 million use of fund balance. Now, as you can see, that estimated fund balance at the end of this fiscal year is just under $600,000. Moving into fiscal year 23, there's actually $156,000 addition to that fund balance. So the total fund balance at the end of fiscal year 23 is projected to be at $754,000, or just under 16%.
So, seen the cycle a number of times, right? The non-election, the first 3 years of the non-election year. Not saying you haven't done it yet. But right, you build up the fund balance, and then in the election year, you spend down the fund balance, right? And it just, if you look at 2022, or to the, I think Council's point earlier, better, on a preventative maintenance perspective, it's better to fix it, sooner rather my opinion, put too much money away just, for those kind of big bursts. Just my opinion.
Through the chair, I don't know if Butch will agree or Dan or Tim, but I think in the last 8 years, we spent a lot of money, not just because it's election, the roads every year. It just wasn't the election year. And yeah, maybe a few more got done during the election year, but we fixed a lot of roads. The fund balance needs to come up, because again, one major thing, do what we can, but we gotta keep that in mind.
And just going to the numbers, right, if all those years were roughly, say, 4 million, and last year was 6.9. And then this year we'll be back, to roughly, 4.5. I mean, it was a big burst. Attribute that to whatever, it was a big burst last year. All right, any other questions on the road fund? What's that?
So, up next, Mr. Chairman, is the Act 179 Rubbish Fund. So, this is a separate fund, and in this fund there is a millage as well as fees for the services related to the animal shelter, as well as the compost site and the rubbish collection. So, that being said, it's its own separate fund, so we're going to start with the fund balance, which is on page 13 or page 42 if you're looking at the middle numbers. So the current budget has pretty much a balanced budget. It was a $400 positive, but the proposed fiscal year 22 projected budget actually has an addition of about $200,000, $210,000 to fund balance. The projected ending fund balance for fiscal year 22 is at $2.2 million, and then going into fiscal year 23, the use of fund balance of $11,000 gives you an estimated fund balance at the end of fiscal year 23 projected to be $2.2 million, or approximately 33% of revenue. And then in this department you have your revenues, and then you have your two departments, which is animal shelter and compost and rubbish.
Any questions?
I got a question. Mr. Richards, the dump truck that we use to transfer on the compost site, is that the newer one? Does it have air?
No, well, I think you're referring to the 309. Yeah, from now on, the vehicles that are put down there will have air conditioning. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. For somebody who worked down there for 8 years, I totally, I'm on board with what you're getting at, yes. These vehicles are fully will not be put through that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, if there's not another question, then we'll move on to the next fund. And I believe we start getting to our utility fund, yes, okay. So there's 3 utility funds that the city currently has. There's the sewage disposal fund, the water fund, and also the smaller Ecorse Creek fund, and then we'll go each one individually. So starting on page 14, so with these funds, just to kind of go over my spiel with these funds, these are called enterprise funds. These are different than all the other funds that we've been talking about. And what that means is the actual method of accounting is different than what we use for our budget basis. So sometimes when you're looking at the actual data from years in the prior years, you may see line items like depreciation. Well, we don't budget for depreciation. Instead, we budget for capital outlay. So 2 methods of accounting. I'll be happy to go through any of that questions with you guys if you guys have questions after the meeting. But you may have some questions of, hey, why do I see depreciation in fiscal year 19 through 20, but I don't see it in our budget, is because we don't budget for it because it's a non-cash item, a non-resource item. So what we budget for, and this is, every city does it this way too, is we budget for resources. The fees coming in and the expenses going out. So, but it is a little confusing for people who don't understand that, so I'll try my best to explain as we go through some of the questions. So, that being said, for the sewer fund, we have, for fiscal year 23, we actually propose to have $8.2 million in revenue, and we have budgeted about $9.4 million in expenses. So what that does is that looks like that's going to be about a $1.2 million decrease in what I call reserve.